USC is a school based on a sense of community.
A community shared between students, faculty, staff, and even the surrounding neighborhood.
With a wide variety of guests, from professionals to students, Behind the Scenes at SC is a safe place for discussing and learning about issues that directly impact USC students.
Made by students for students,
and anyone else who's curious. We hope you take something valuable away from these episodes, just as we did by making them.
Thank you for listening.
Even when we talk about mental health, so much of it is placed on the individual who's experiencing the mental health challenges as opposed to looking at the systemic factors.
Welcome to SCWell, where we talk about all things wellness in the USC community. From mental health to wellness tips, we're promoting this much-needed dialogue between students and administration in this safe space. I'm your host, Paulina Suarez. Today we have podcast host of its Growing Season podcast and USC Class of 2023, Maggie Lee. Hi Maggie, thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
And Danielle Gautt, the Assistant Director of Outreach and Prevention Services and a licensed clinical worker. Hi Danielle, thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me here as well.
How do you think that talking about your mental health with others has helped in your personal discoveries?
Students are reaching out for support unlike ever before. And I do think that is a great thing. And just if we compare 2019 fall to 2021, the students are signing up for Let's Talk, which are just unofficial conversations with a therapist. They're not considered therapy, but just those barriers seem to be decreasing.
I think the biggest change I noticed was with my family. I grew up in a quite traditional family, and we didn't really talk about mental health. I'm the youngest of 5 kids, and my older siblings, they've all struggled with mental health issues. And, whether they know it or not, I feel like we all kind of, even like with anxiety, I think we sometimes, like you said, we sometimes don't know whether it's like normal anxiety or if it's like anxiety that can actually be harmful to your health. I think ever since I started my podcast, I've kind of made it a normal thing to talk about within the household. And even among my friends, I hear a lot of people talking more casually about like, oh, I spoke to my therapist about this, or like I heard this from a podcast, and kind of making this more of a normal part of everyday life. And it's awesome because 2 years ago, 2019, when I was a freshman, this was not a thing. So I feel like the pandemic, even though it was definitely really hard on people's mental health, it did, kind of force people to start seeking help.
In 2019, 3 USC students were confirmed to have died via suicide. An article published by The Times goes into detail about this and states that the entire student body received notice about it on both September 4th and November 9th. The article also claims that even a small fraction of USC students seeking help would collectively overwhelm mental health services. In response to the deaths, USC moved to open a new psychiatric ward. How can current SC strategies or resources be improved?
Suicide is difficult, to say the least. And what we know is individuals who die by suicide are experiencing a tremendous amount of pain. And so part of that is the changing some of the culture at USC, right? And really moving away from this idea that, this particular person has the issue and the challenges is they weren't able to access services and that must be the reason they died, rather than looking at the culture that contributes systemically to suicide. When we look across the country, it's not unique to USC. And particularly this age group, we're seeing a significant increase in numbers of students, or not really students, young adults rather, in that age, dying by suicide. And to me, it speaks to a larger cultural shift that's needed. We need to re-examine the pressures that are placed on individuals. We need to look at other factors that contribute to suicide. Even when we talk about mental health, so much of it is placed on the individual who's experiencing the mental health challenges as opposed to looking at the systemic factors. And so when we look at this, there are definitely systemic factors that contribute to suicide that extend well beyond access to the appointment, right? When we look at racism, access to healthcare, when we look at poverty, when we look at substance use, all of these things contribute to that. And so I don't want to oversimplify it by saying, hey, the services are what's wrong. And so there's changes coming in terms of opening access, but there's a really big part of prevention. We're working with the Judd Foundation, which specifically targets suicide in higher education to do prevention work. How do we ask really difficult questions? And I don't want to, again, oversimplifying it by saying, hey, if we give this person access, as opposed to looking at what are some of those factors that contribute to suicide.
It sounds like you're saying as students, we also play a big role in checking in on our friends and just noticing little things that we can do and, again, create this dialogue between our friends and just make sure everyone's okay.
Yeah, I'm saying students, but also the campus at large. I'm saying we're a community, and everyone in the community plays a role.
What are some of the coping strategies that you like to advise others to use?
So I think when it comes to coping strategies, it's really going to vary depending on what the person is experiencing. And when we talk about stress and when we talk about really students who are in distress, it tends to impact a couple different areas, right? It may show up behaviorally, right? Someone may have trouble getting out of bed. It may show up emotionally. Someone may notice they're more tearful. It may show up in their interactions with others where they're a little more irritated or short or not wanting to engage. And so the coping skills will vary. But what I stress to everyone is creating a routine, particularly in these times. And what helps us is having something that is predictable, something that is consistent, and focusing on things around us that we can influence.
Yeah, 100%. Routine. I feel like my life is just made up of different routines. But for me personally, I feel like I'm a very all or nothing person where if I have a routine, if I don't do it, I get stressed out. So it's like kind of counterintuitive. So for me, I would say routine definitely, but also adding a little bit of flexibility in my life. Because if I don't do something and I get stressed out, then what was the point of, like that's actually harmful for my mental health.
And I just want to kind of add on to when you mentioned flexibility. Flexibility is so important.
Mhm.
I think that's one thing in terms of rigidity or all or nothing thinking that contributes to the lot of distress that we see with students coming in for services. And it makes sense that it's increasing in terms of, again, kind of a lack of control, current events. And so we're clinging for something that's very predictable.
What does a safe space mean to you? And how do you think we could create it for students at USC?
The first thing that comes to mind is not really a place, it's more of a feeling for me. A safe space feels like peace. And for me, that is a feeling of being free from anxiety, free from worries. I'm someone who gets anxious a lot. So this is something that I'm learning myself too. But for me, being able to be with my friends and talk without having to worry about, being judged.
I think it's important to have safe spaces. And so sometimes safe space is your environment, right? What are you doing where you live? And really looking at how can you cultivate spaces to meet your needs. It's the most important thing that someone can do, to have those spaces to express really that vulnerability.
I recently talked to a spiritual counselor from the USC's Religious and Spiritual Life Center, and she was amazing. She's also from Taiwan, so we got to speak in like English and Mandarin, and that felt so much like a safe space. It felt like home. It's nice to have someone who comes from like a similar cultural background because there's so many nuances that maybe is hard to understand if you didn't grow up in that environment. Once you find like a good one, dive deeper into that so you know that you're not alone.
USC is full of students maintaining consistently high performance levels. A place with such high standards might make talking about mental health a little difficult, and it may even exacerbate issues that were presented at home or in high school. How can we foster safe space for healthy discussion?
It's important to distinguish between safety and comfort. I think sometimes we confuse the two, right? I think safety does exist here on campus in a variety of spaces, but challenging that comfort is hard. Making that realization that I need extra support around my mental health it's challenging, and I don't want to minimize what a student may experience even coming into Ingham for resources, right? How mental health is viewed in their culture or their family or their own way that they conceptualize their mental health. How do we increase comfort around these conversations? And we're doing that in a variety of ways. One through Let's Talk. You mentioned providers with shared identities. We have faculty in our SCIP areas, so someone at CBCSA, La Casa, APAS, OIS, intentionally with varying identities because we're trying to increase comfort. We're trying to make sure that mental health providers are accessible. Let's Talk is a really big push that I recommend to people because it's not a clinical service. There's no documentation, there's no notes taking. It's kind of like I'm curious about mental health and I want to talk to a professional. And we also have those based on identity. And so we're really trying to increase accessibility and that feeling of comfort and safety, but primarily comfort when it comes to mental health services. And so we're talking about a culture shift when we talk about really increasing comfort and increasing safety. People are starting to feel more supported in their mental health.
Through your outreach, what have you learned about the student impact with mental health?
The impact is far reaching. If I use CBCSA for an example, right, they have a Black Table Talk where they're really trying to challenge rather stigma. And one of our CMH faculty member goes and it's just conversations about what is it like being Black on campus and how does that impact our wellness. It's something that is going to continue to keep giving because you're normalizing it.
Yeah. I actually have a question for you. I think a lot of people are scared to be vulnerable. How would you suggest people like slowly peeling away, those hard barriers around them to be more comfortable in sharing?
I think if someone wants to be more vulnerable, but they're struggling with the idea of being vulnerable, like I really want to say this.
Yeah.
I think to question why they aren't saying it, right? Rather than saying you need to be vulnerable, because 9 times out of 10, we're significantly more critical of ourselves than we are other individuals, right? And so less about the vulnerability, but what is the fear that's often rooted in some kind of judgment or distortion that someone may have, right? That if I share that I'm struggling, then someone else is going to think A, B, and C, right? And really challenging that will help someone become more vulnerable, right? What is actually stopping them? Vulnerability is a skill. It's something that we're not always socialized or isn't necessarily normal in our culture. I'd argue for a fair amount of college students, it can be challenging because you're here to perform, right? What is your GPA? How did you do on that exam? How did that production go? And so it creates a space where it's really hard to say, I don't know the answer, right? Or I'm struggling. And so it's moving away and really shifting. How do you conceptualize your idea as a student, right? I often ask students, what does it mean to be successful, right? Who are you beyond your GPA, right? These are all things that I think can lead to more honest conversations and more discussions.
I totally agree. I think the resources are definitely there, but how do we foster a safe culture where we can talk about these things? And, I think a lot of times people don't know how to express that. Like their coping mechanism maybe isn't as healthy. They could resort to drinking or, other more harmful coping mechanisms compared to actually talking it out and releasing it. But I do agree that, like, as a campus, if we talk to our friends and we reach out to our friends, at the end of the day, we're all interconnected. So when we're reaching out to our friends, it could actually just be like, I don't really know how, I'm like trying to visualize it. At the end of the day, everyone is connected with everyone on campus. So if we all reach out to someone and, if we reach out to someone, and they reach out to someone, the entire campus will be supported in that way. And I just think that it's so helpful, especially if, whoever's listening, if you personally feel like it's easier for you to talk about mental health, reach out to someone who you notice or you observe maybe have a harder time expressing that. And I think at the end of the day, it's just about reaching out to people and checking in, because that can make a huge difference. Maybe no one has ever checked in on them and they've been, trying to handle that by themselves and resorting to unhealthy coping mechanisms that other people can't see, because mental health is invisible. And like if we see someone in a cast, we'll immediately reach out to them and ask if they're okay. But it's a little bit more nuanced with mental health, I think.
And I want to, in terms of systems, kind of publicize something that I think is important for everyone to know about, right? We do have supports on campus as Trojans Care for Trojans. And the reason that's important is you can fill out a report on anyone. And mental health, we are no different than coming in to see, let's say, a medical doctor, where we won't go out to check on the person. They are under student affairs, and what they will do is they will check and see if the person went to class, contact that residential support if they're in student housing. If a welfare check is needed, they will coordinate that. And those are really important services for someone who may be at risk of imminent harm. Where when we look at counseling and mental health services, it's outpatient care that someone has to be coming into. And so there's a lot of support around mental health on campus.
I want to thank you both for coming and sharing all your wisdom and knowledge with us today.
On behalf of our team, we want to thank you for listening with open ears and an open heart. We urge you to continue to discuss these issues and work together as a community to create a dialogue that progresses us forward. Thank you to our producers, Jackson Kroof and Christy Taiwo Makanjola, our post-media manager, Vince Gonzalez, our composer, Joel Jimenez, and last but certainly not least, our guests. Please like and subscribe. Fight on.